Well, I was just going to say that every time Josiah launches Craig and he goes, "No recording," I jump a little.
Yeah. I use a Discord bot called Craig for anyone unfamiliar, and it it does a very loud
now recording
when we press the record button.
I've always said that the best way that the key to improv is to ask everyone what you're gonna do for improv when you start.
Yeah, that's my favorite way of.
So I ask, so what's the cold open, guys?
Yeah, what's the cold open? And
we can talk about.
Okay.
I was gonna say we could talk about the fact that Craig sounds like a dime store Darth Vader.
That's true. That's true.
That's the end of that joke.
Yeah, I don't know if we have much more we can extract from that. Oh, man.
I am your father.
Oh, man.
Okay, so I guess there's not too much to say other than this is what everyone's been waiting for, the return of the book club.
Yep,
and an opportunity to hear three white guys talk about the colonial exploitation of Africa.
Yeah, here we go.
Via a book written by a black man.
Yep, here we go. Awesome. Yeah, I don't know what the right answer for that is, because I think it's good we're reading this and discussing it. But there's probably 100%. Some truth to if you don't want to listen to three white guys tackle this subject, I understand.
And there is, like I was saying to you earlier, there is a very, very long YouTube video by African scholars presenting at Vanderbilt, if you want to listen to that instead.
Maybe Josiah can include it in the show links.
I will put that in the show notes.
A little bit
Send
more,
that to me.
A little bit more qualified than three podcasters. But if you're still here, I'm just hemorrhaging members. Hemorrhaging listeners.
The best way to do a podcast is you start it off by telling people reasons you shouldn't be listening to this podcast.
Here's a better podcast.
Yeah, this is really helping out. Thanks, guys.
This might be the height of Icarian hubris right here.
Well, I mean, I think the takeaway from these book clubs is, of course, that other people should also read these books. And that's ultimately what we're saying. You should read this book. It is good. I mean, fuck it. I feel like we've done a cold open. Fuck it. I should read our quote. Should we get moving here?
Let's go.
All right.
LFG.
Reading from the beginning. I don't remember. From How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. Here we go. In recent times, it has become an object of concern to some liberals that the United States is capable of war crimes of the order of My Lai in Vietnam. But the fact of the matter is that the My Lais began with the enslavement of Africans and American Indians. Racism, violence, and brutality were the concomitants of the capitalist system when it extended itself abroad in the early centuries of international trade. Welcome to the third installment of the Fruitless Book Club. You are listening to the Fruitless Book Club, a podcast within a podcast where we read all those nonfiction books we've been meaning to get around to. This is episode 3, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, where we discuss Walter Rodney's seminal work on colonialism and the exploitation of Africa. Say welcome everybody to another exciting installment of my favorite Fruitless series. This podcast within a podcast I've been doing. I've been really enjoying these book club episodes. So I'm joined today by I'm Josiah, of course, and I'm joined today by Chris Barker.
Hello.
And Jake the lawyer.
I'm honored to be included in your favorite podcast spin-off series.
It's a podcast within a podcast.
a little podcast matrushka.
That's right. Well, we decided that we really enjoyed how much colonialism bummed the fuck out of us last time, so we continued with that theme, and we're tackling how Europe underdeveloped Africa, which is also, I mean, this is the third book club thus far, but I will say the most Marxist book we've read thus far. Like,
incredibly Marxist.
Yeah, like Davis was a Marxist, in late Victorian Holocaust, but it was more like it was his methodology in the background. This is a Marxist.
Yeah.
Proud to
and not just any Marxist, but I think it's notable to and we'll get to this. He's very much a Leninist. He's very much a vanguard, a bourgeois vanguard supporter. Which makes sense because he was part of that class.
Mm-hmm.
So How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is by Walter Rodney, who was like you said, a Marxist historian and activist from Guyana. He was first in his class in his high school. He ended up going to university in Jamaica and eventually went to the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, which at the time was a leading place to study Africa, Asia, and the Middle East.
Three regions that totally should just be lumped together and treated as one blob, of course, right? Yeah. Nailing it over there, Britain.
I love the West. So good at teaching history.
We've got our Department of French History over here, and then Department of all the other parts of the world.
Right. Very good at taking other people's lives seriously.
So he didn't have to do this. He didn't have to go this hard, but he did flex on us by completing his PhD at 24.
Jesus Christ.
In African history.
Rude as hell.
And he eventually moved back to Guyana to be a professor, but his appointment was rescinded, probably on account of the
communism
associations with working class groups, political organizations, and basically spent his life working in activist circles, and finally was assassinated by bomb in Georgetown in Guyana on June 13th, 1980. And recently, relatively recently, the Guyanese government came out and said, yeah, we did it.
Yeah, which is interesting because, as we noted, a lot of stuff like even Wikipedia or whatever has not caught up with that information. Like it is still treated as a conspiracy theory if you say that he was assassinated by the Guyanese government, but he was they admitted to.
Yeah, they were like, that's our bad.
Yeah, we did that. Sorry. Yeah. It's like, I think the basically verbatim what they said.
Yeah. So that's Walter Rodney. I mean, when we say he was a Marxist, he was a dyed in the wool, this is how the dialectic works. This is how history works. And it influenced every part of his understanding and is the underlying theme of this book. I think he does a really good job of keeping to that. He describes the development. I tend to take issue with the rigidity of Marxist developmental stages, while understanding that Marx allows for some flex between stages. It's still a little bit difficult to really, throughout history, trace a line. And I know he was talking about Europe, but I appreciate how Rodney distinguishes the developmental track of Africa from the developmental track of Europe, even if I still take issue with the overarching developmental stages that we talk about. And I just think that, like we said, definitely read this book. This is one of the most clearly set out arguments for the existence and continuation of a colonial exploitative project in Africa.
Yeah, because I would say this book, I think that it is so consistent with its Leninist framework that I think it ends it, even if you do not adhere to a strict Marxist Leninist, which I don't think any of us do. I don't think any of us are committed Leninists. It's still an incredibly helpful lens, and is just like, even with some of the limitations that we'll kind of point out about Lenin, kind of this Marxist Leninist perspective. At the end of the day, I mean, this thing nails it on the head of what.
Yeah, the argument's quite convincing.
Yeah.
Stages aside, I'm really being nitpicky. There's nothing false about his overarching thesis, which is that Europe exploited Africa and kept it from reaching relative levels of prosperity. Purposely and systematically.
Because I think, and I don't even think Rodney would be this strict to like a Marxist-Leninist framework, but, I think it is still useful to go, Africa was in the middle of moving out of communalism to feudalism when Europeans arrived. And because of that, it disrupted the process that was taking place. You can, I think, accept that is a very good argument in explaining what took place without necessarily buying that whatever they were developing would have looked exactly like European feudalism, because the laws of history develop in the same way. Who knows what Africa would have developed if it hadn't been disrupted? Yeah. And so, and that's exactly the point. That Africa didn't get to develop. We don't know what a Africa that had been able to develop on its own without people coming in and fucking it up looks like, because that didn't happen.
Yeah, and there's actually, and of course I'm blanking on the scholar. There's actually a little bit of scholarship for the idea that Africa was moving a little bit more slowly in its development process, precisely because it was trying to several societies. I don't want to say Africa like a monolith, because obviously it's not, but there were civilizations in Africa that were developing similar technologies and societal structures to Europe, but it was moving a little bit more slowly because they were being deliberate about advancing society in a way that would not betray certain egalitarian ideals.
Yeah, and this is where you could kind of bring in David Graeber with Dawn of Everything kind of here too, is kind of pointing out that we should assume that the act of developing structures was oftentimes a conscious thing, and people were going, I don't know whether we want this, or if we are going to start building up a structure like this, how do we do this in a way that it doesn't kill a bunch of people? And I mean, frankly, the advantage that Europe got over the rest of the world was one of
deciding not to care if people died.
Yeah, lack of empathy almost within the structures of that society. It was just, we were fine with crushing people. This isn't to idealize too much the state of things in any other part of the world. There is always oppression going on, as any good Marxist would also say, like Walt Rodney gets into.
And Rodney himself admits that there were all sorts of different types of oppression in African societies.
Yeah, because he's not like a he is pushing back both on colonialist, or as he likes to say, the bourgeois academics. He's pushing back against them, but he's also pushing back, but subtle, less heavily, against more African nationalist histories as well. He's not a nationalist, and he's not interested in nationalist histories. And there was a time, a kind of a tendency at this time to write these histories that are there was this perfect idealized Africa before Europeans arrived. And he's like, well, let's not kid ourselves, but also let's not also act like the arrival of Europeans didn't completely destroy what did exist and what good things were there.
But he also there's a few sections where he really hits on the way that Europe specifically prevented the rise of nationalisms. It's kind of, I think it's in either chapter
toward the
4
end
or 5, but the way that Europeans, once they got in here, were very, very set on we're keeping things quote unquote tribal.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the most fascinating things.
Like,
it was
like the Europeans were desperate to avoid letting their colonial subjects develop national consciousness. Because that would have been truly powerful.
Yeah, not to mention, like, you know, what he talks about, like, you know, people talking about Africa as like tribal, quotes around that. That's he's kind of trying to push back against that. And part of what he's also saying is that, like, well, Europe arriving during the development of feudalism in Africa and disrupting that process also disrupted the process of how something like feudalism develops, which is this kind of, getting attached to the land and then negotiating differences between small clans and tribes and forming an identity that will later on down the dialectic be able to be called nations. Right. And that got disrupted. There was and intentionally heightened. All those tribal differences, all those the differences between clans, whatever, got heightened under the colonial system. And so you didn't have the natural, at least, in this framework, natural process of negotiating differences and forming a large social order together.
Yeah. But also at the same time, like, physician heal thyself, Europeans calling anyone else tribal.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we our first entry in the book club was the Basque history of the world, right?
Yeah,
the Basques.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. There's European regionalism is like a thing.
Yeah. Like, the Basques are the most leave us alone and get the fuck out people that I've ever heard of.
And of course, you fast forward all of the heightening of these tribal differences that you're talking about. Basically, they speed run it. They draw arbitrary borders, which lump people together as though they are monoliths.
Mm-hmm. People with maybe different economic systems, not even just ethnic differences, complete different economic systems, just
cultural, ethnic, and economic difference, all types of stuff. I mean, imagine being from Texas and having to share land with Oklahoma. I'm kidding. I'm just.
Thank you.
We're gonna turn this into
anti-Oklahoma podcast.
We're gonna turn this little sub podcast into Jake and Chris make Josiah a sports fan.
Yeah, when we go into the fruitless sports corner.
Yep. I do need to get a theme song or something for that, but. Well,
we just do it ourselves, like they do on Worst of All Possible Worlds.
There we go. It's perfect.
Sports corner.
Which obviously, listen to Worst of All Possible Worlds. It's a great show.
Yes, previous episode was quite good.
Thank you.
Liked it quite a lot. Good job, Brian.
Hell yeah.
You are truly the worst of all possible ones.
The half of the episode that I listened to was very good. I still need to finish it. I apologize. I'm a bad fruitless listener. But anyway, let's talk
about development. Let's move to that. Like, move into like kind of where he starts. So he starts off by defining development and underdevelopment, which I'd say, like, this seems to be all of us who have like the beef with the Leninism. This is really the only chunk that I think we would have had some of the beef with. But
although he does start it off hard with a nice little epigram from Che at the start of the chapter.
That rules. That makes me happy. Yeah, so this chunk does have a few poorly aged stuff, but I don't think is that crazy to imagine a open communist in 1970s writing this. A lot of stuff hadn't come out yet, but there's a lot of poorly aged, like, the USSR, which is developing really fast and has no problems whatsoever with that.
There definitely is an affection for socialist, quote unquote, socialist states. Mm-hmm. It exists, like, quote unquote, actually existing socialism at the time that Rodney is writing. Which, look, I don't care what anybody says. That's totally fair.
Yeah, Josiah and I were talking about that right before you hopped on. Actually, it's just like, I mean, if you're a communist, like, these are the only examples you've got against this sea of.
Yeah,
bags of dicks.
Bags of dicks. And then, like, I don't know, like, if I was going to disregard a history for praising, some regimes that did some bad stuff, there's like a lot of just Western history that I have read that I would have to disregard as well. Like, we don't bat a fucking eye.
Have you heard of this book called Late Victorian Holocaust?
Right. That's what I mean is like when we talk about like if somebody was trying to like lecture Rodney and be like, well, you celebrating the USSR, you know how many people the USSR killed? It could be easy to go, okay, how many people has Britain killed? And yet, how many?
You don't understand. They were killed by the market. The market did that.
Right. So it's like I don't.
As though they didn't fucking invent it.
Yeah, they invented the market and then blamed the market for their problems. That's fucked up. At least the USSR was like, yeah, Stalin did it. Stalin didn't invent a guy to be responsible for his problems.
I don't want
Make up a guy to get mad at. It's called the market. Type of guy. It's the market.
It's the market. But yeah, so he talks about development as in a very like Marxist sense of like
stages.
Stages, yes, but also that like it is all the different ways, both in social organization, technology, education, whatever, all the ways that humans' capacity to impact and deal with nature can be expanded. That's it. That's development. And so that's, when we talk about the whole big picture history of the world, that goes from the development of fucking fire way back in the, millions of years ago, the discovery of fire and realizing we can cook meat. Now we're not laying around all the time to like fucking, to developing markets and complex, ways of organizing a society around wage labor and whatever, the hellscape we live in now. These are all varying degrees of that.
Or architecture, transportation, any number of everything. That's all, Having a house that keeps you dry and warm is an improvement over not having one.
Yeah.
That's a good development.
Yeah. And it's important to remember, like we said, he's talking about Marxist development, which goes from communalism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism, and then to Marx obviously thought it was going to be socialism.
But now but instead it's capitalism that's on your phone. It turns out that was the next stage. I think it reminds me a little bit of Marx. Marx's understanding of how close we were to socialism reminds me of two things. One is the apostles just post ascension. Oh yeah,
things are it's just going to happen. Any day now.
And the other is actually Marx's inspiration, Hegel, who believed that he had his own version of the dialectic, and he believed that it was over, that they had reached.
The end of history was constitutional monarchy.
He is the OG end of history guy. We've done it in whatever.
He thought that we had reached synthesis.
Yeah, which was constitutional monarchy.
Reforming in the reforming monarchs of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I'm pretty sure I have that timeline right?
I'm pretty sure. That sounds
right. Franz Josef, the whatever the fuck. Was the guy. He was him, and there was no way to move past that. So I think that Marx and many of the Marxists, even through Rodney's era, were like a little bit apocalyptic in a sense.
Yeah, because with the Soviet Union alive and being a world power at the time, and China growing to be a world power at the time, it really fucking felt like it might be about to happen.
For sure. Yeah.
Also, you might be apocalyptic if there was a very real chance of a nuclear war.
That's also
100%.
true.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
I'm not saying they were. I'm not saying they were wrong for feeling that way.
Yeah.
I mean, Hegel was wrong, but for feeling that way. But I'm not saying that the Marxists were wrong for feeling that way. I'm just saying that this is the mindset that they are living in
Right,
when
right.
they're writing about this stuff.
Well, and you could probably, although it isn't it isn't as clear as like Hegel or Marx, what thinker you could point to, but you could probably say something about the present now too, with the state of, like, with environmental catastrophe lingering overhead. There's a sense that whatever it is, it's about to happen. So
yeah, I wish. I'm not as optimistic as that.
No,
but,
I'm not.
Or pessimistic, depending on your take. But
depending. But so on the flip side, we have development, like we mentioned there, but we also have underdevelopment, which is
yes.
a relative term. So it's not that there is a lack of development. There is no such thing as a group of humans that lacks some form of development, as Rodney is adamant to say. That just doesn't exist, because always people organize and they do shit. But it's a comparative thing. Being underdeveloped is relative to a different power that is developed. And what's underdevelopment? It's not being developed enough to handle, say, some new economic system, but it's also a thing that can happen to you. Those things you've developed can get disrupted. The process you're making can be stopped, or can even be reversed. Like, say a bunch of guys start buying all of your labor and sailing it over to the new world. That might disrupt the development of a civilization or something. I don't know. Like,
that would be crazy if that happened. Luckily
that didn't happen. Yeah.
Yeah, no, Josiah, you hit exactly what I was like about to like hop in. Like that underdevelopment is a thing that can be done to you.
Yeah.
And it's like it shouldn't, being underdeveloped should not be seen as a judgment upon the people who are living in that state, because they might not have been able to resist that happening to them effectively.
Yeah.
They also might just not have the resources. Like,
yeah,
it's almost like being developed or underdeveloped is like a moral judgment.
Yeah. But it shouldn't be. It's like,
yeah, it shouldn't be. Yeah.
It can be like a shadow that is visited upon you rather than a shadow that you cast.
Yeah, and it's not Rodney saying. Of course, it's not Rodney saying that that's a moral judgment. It's the capitalists, essentially.
It's the damn bourgeois scholars.
Yeah, exactly. And I did just want to, in terms of relative underdevelopment, I did want to mention this. I believe it was at least somewhat close to the time of writing for Rodney, for How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He compares the annual per capita income of several countries, and just a couple of those are the United States at the top. Let's go, number one, USA, at $3,578 in 1970s money, early 1970s money, per capita. And we've got the Congo taking an L at $52.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Awesome. So
that's what
I wonder why that could be.
Yeah.
Even in 70s numbers, that's not a lot of money.
No. Not at all.
Well, the idea is that, and people will come in and say, oh, well, things are cheaper in the Congo. Okay. Why are things cheaper?
Well,
because it's not as developed. Well, why is it not as developed? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, it feels like it might be worth interrogating, but it isn't, because it's often not like, this book is almost 50 years old, right? And yet I still think there is, when talking about the state of the quote unquote third world, there is still very often an attitude of, oh dear, how did this happen? Look at this state of things here. Ugh.
It's like what this reminded me of when obviously Rodney deals with these arguments very well, but it did remind me immediately of Matt Iglesias and his classic article on.
It's good for sweatshop workers to die.
Yeah, Bangladesh. It's okay for Bangladesh to have loosened worker safety
Oh,
provisions.
cool,
Wait,
man.
Josiah, are you familiar with that article?
I have heard of it but never read it.
It's
Yes,
awesome.
Yeah,
it's
It's
it is. It's quite a set of sentences to decide to type.
yeah.
it's very,
I'm
very interesting. Like you were saying, this book is 50 years old, and I believe 51 years old, and it is you're still having to refute the same well-worn arguments that just get trotted out for why actually, and of course we'll get to all this, actually colonialism was good, and if it wasn't good then it wasn't that bad, and if it actually was bad then they deserved it.
yeah.
Like,
No.
Yeah. I'd say
it's
that's the perfect three-tier form of how the argument is made.
Well, I feel like that is a defense mechanism from those of us in the West, quote unquote West, who can just look at what we have obviously done, and like if we truly reckoned with what we have obviously done, we would feel very bad all the time.
Yeah.
oh
And
yeah,
and so you just have to like act like I didn't do that. I didn't break that. I didn't
it's
just take
totally
it.
a coping mechanism.
Yeah, I didn't
It's
just
it's
totally take
totally
a
a
shit all
psychological
over
wall.
these people's kitchen. Like, I didn't do
Yeah.
that. No.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot more statistics we could rattle off, but suffice to say that um, African states, colonial African states were and still are not doing well relative to the West, if you weren't aware.
hmm Yeah, and we'll so let's get into the history of why that's the case and how exactly that happened. And I think there's something that the title of this book is really bold. You know what I mean? And I think I've become familiar enough with the book of like hearing about it enough that I have kind of not realized how bold of a title it is until I had brought it up to somebody, and the way they're like, oh, okay, I know the author's thesis, was kind of their response, because the book is just straight up like, I think what's interesting and intentional about it too is the way he's using underdeveloped, because it's a verb that's being done to someone else, which is not how the word usually gets used.
Yep.
And I think that's pretty conscious. But yeah, okay, so getting into the history here, he walks through kind of the history of Africa prior to the arrival of Europeans. Now, this is if you're not familiar with African history, can get a little confusing. So there is a difference between the arrival of Europeans and then the colonial era. And especially if you're an American European, or American, especially if you're American, you think of the colonial period usually as being like the 15th century when the Europeans arrived. But as as we'll talk about with this, the way it played out in Africa was the actual like colonization was that scramble for Africa in the 19th century. Prior to that was a different type of relationship. It was colonial in nature, but it isn't like the formation of colonies in Africa in quite the same way. It's about extracting through markets early on, through trade and the slave trade especially. But yeah, so just to clarify, arrival of Europeans, there's a couple hundred years, and then we get to colonization proper. So that's kind of important to kind of think that through.
I would just one like very minor quibble that I have with the idea of the arrival of the Europeans is that like, I mean, they've been, Africa is very large, as we all know, and a decent chunk of it is literally on the border of the Mediterranean Sea. Europeans had been coming to Africa for a very, very long time. Mark Antony famously fucked Cleopatra.
Right. Well, and because of that, I mean, let's talk about how the underdevelopment, stuff like that, right? Development did not take place evenly throughout Africa, and this is a big thing God goes through. And so yeah, there's something to that as well. Well, North Africa is where you start to see feudal stuff forming. And it, in part because of its closeness with the kind of Arabs coming in and the Muslim conquests, and then Europe as well. It's interacting with as part of the Mediterranean broadly, and then as you get further and further south, you get more into the communalist kind of settings or whatever, right? One thing I will say I really appreciated about chapter 2 of this book, where it's, talking about Africa's development prior to the 15th century, is that this is history I just don't know very well or at all. And so it was just really, it's really nice to have it laid out so straightforward. It felt like a textbook for a little bit in a good way.
Yeah. I remember him talking about the harnessing of camels and the way that like people call them ships of the desert or whatever, but it truly is they used camels as fucking ships. Tanker ships.
Yeah.
And that's really crazy that they were able to do that and essentially treat the desert as an ocean to sail, but just with feet.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so the early kind of stuff he's talking about a development is often the gold trade in the kind of the Saharan region. And that trade network was fucking fascinating to read about. I did not know any of that.
And the extent to which intricate metal work was endemic in large areas of the continent. They had figured out how to do this stuff. Just because we came in and wrecked it later doesn't mean that they hadn't figured it out already. And you can there's all these incredible artifacts that were put together by people with more skill than I have.
Yeah.
I was also going to say, I do think it's interesting. I did have a little bit of wait a second moment. My alarm goes off a little bit whenever I see people start to talk about barter. I don't know if you've ever. I believe I've mentioned it in both episodes in which I've been present of this podcast. Now,
David Graeber's
a
Debt.
Wonderful book called "Debt: The First 5,000 Years" by David Graeber, which you should absolutely read. Which is an anthropological history of money and debt. Very, very, very fascinating. And one thing that I think is interesting is based on David Graeber's research and scholarship, you don't actually see, the classic Adam Smithian capitalist history of money is that currency, or that is that money develops when the double coincidence of wants is too much of a strain. You can't always find someone that wants your chickens and has a cow that you want. You need something to stand in, right? But you're bartering up until you develop money.
Yeah, and then eventually you decide one of these commodities is our currency now.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Which that's not generally how money develops. We already have systems for that. That might be how currency comes about sometimes, but that's not really how we develop money. Credit money has existed since time immemorial, since the earliest human communities. At least from what I remember reading in Debt, you see credit money being used, and you only really see, according to Graeber, you only really see barter in societies where a state had previously existed but had then fallen away for whatever reason. That is when those communities resorted to barter.
Right.
Which I think is just interesting. But anyway, that's just a little aside. When I saw Rodney talk about how different African communities used barter until they started using things like cowrie shells as currency, it kind of ticked off my Graeber senses. And I did have to bring that up. Obviously, I'm not really sure what Rodney's sources are, but I did want to note that in the anthropological record, it's very rare that currency systems develop, or that barter precedes
currency
development.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So it's more like barter arises from desperation and a lack of a guarantor of debt. Am I
Yeah,
understanding that correctly?
I think that makes sense. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that
Okay.
that would be Graeber's position on this, and you know, and
Okay.
I don't know exactly. Like you said, I don't know what sources he's using in this, and also like what Graeber's, why you and I are both big fans of Graeber, but part of what his shtick was updating a lot of stuff with new information that was coming in, and so like part of that is just like I just don't know if there was the record that we now have anthropologically for pushing away from the barter system at the time that this was written. Um,
Yeah,
that
yeah. And Graeber even says that's like part of the deal is that you know the economists, as he says, push this barter theory of money, and that actually it's something more like a long disparaged theory of money called the Chartist theory, which we won't get
mhm.
into because that's beyond the scope
Yeah,
of this episode.
yeah. At
But
some point, we'll do debt,
yeah, but read that by David Graeber.
but going back to this here, so moving away from so feudalism, according to Rodney, kind of did develop in North Africa, especially in Egypt, and then in Ethiopia. So these are often places with Abrahamic religions of some sort, that allow for a certain kind of structuring of the state around the religious system, that allows kind of borderline European or Middle Eastern style feudalism to take hold. As you get farther away from those areas with Islam or Christianity or Judaism, you start to get more toward the communalist, in the Marxist terminology, organizations that are at the time working through kind of battles between cultivators and pastoralists, according to Rodney, right? So the
Yeah.
process that was kind of going on at this time was kind of a battle between which was going to end up being the landed elite that would become feudalism. There were these battles between two interest groups. There was dialectics were happening in the south part of
Yes,
Africa.
yeah. The contradictions were being heightened.
They were in the
And
middle of that.
would you say that these communities did not have the correct superstructure that out of which could arise
Mhm.
the necessary conditions for feudalism?
That's right.
As we said, that Rodney is the most Marxist.
He's very
Uh,
Marxist.
I mean, there's basin superstructure, there's dialectics, there's stages. I mean, it's it's actually really really nice. It's very very it helps structure the book very well. But anyway, that's one thing that he discusses is that the religious orientation of the society is an important part of the superstructure or the collection of ideologies arising out of the material conditions of a
Hmm.
society, which would be considered the base. If I
Yeah.
have my Marxist theory correct, I apologize if I'm
Hmm.
screwing that up. But that the superstructures, the ideological superstructures of Ethiopia and Egypt allowed them to develop feudalism or feudal like societies in a way that other societies in Africa
Hmm.
did not were not able.
Right. But
Perhaps
a
you
lot
could
of
call it
them
feudal isham.
feudal isham. Yeah, and you see like these kind of like variations of like half communalism, half feudalism in being formed in these like lower part, the like southern part of Africa, and then like um so like your main economic structures that are taking place is okay. In the north, we've got feudalism. We've got the big Sahara Sea that's being traversed by the camel boats, and then that's the transport of gold is happening throughout that. So Sudan's economy, or the what is it the Western Sudan, so the Empire of Ghana, Mali, Songhai, these are springing up. Kingdoms are springing up through predominantly the gold trade, iron. These are the kind of things that are being able to kind of grow development there. And then, of course, we see an early introduction of what would end up becoming a major problem, which is the slave trade. In the Western Sudan, we're seeing a small slave export. It is not a major aspect of the economy. Well, it's a large chunk of the economy, but it's not as influential as gold and iron, from what I'm gathering, right? But it's a thing. Yeah, there is raiding and capturing people and then selling them.
Yeah, but I mean that's like no different than what the Romans did.
Right. This is this shit is taking place everywhere in the world in some way or another. Right. But this is kind of a Chekhov's gun, right? Like introducing this early on, this is going to be, important.
You don't get this right now, but your kids are going to hate it.
Yeah, your kids are going to hate it.
I'm so sorry. That was not appropriate. But
yeah. So we have that, and then like down in the kind of region that would get become Zimbabwe, regions of like Mozambique, Rhodesia, that kind of area. We're seeing the rise of like pastoralism kind of winning over and kind of developing the feudalism around the pastoralist elites or whatever. And also apparently some really cool ass palaces were built during that time. But
and temples, Great Zimbabwe.
Yep, Great Zimbabwe, which is super interesting, and also very funny as he gets into later bourgeois academics having to make up theories of, well, some white people had to have come down to make these, right? Because these are too cool.
That's literally like the OG version of
ancient aliens.
Well, obviously, aliens had to build the pyramids.
I mean, genuinely, yes, right?
Yeah.
Oh man,
the Mayans couldn't have possibly built all those cool temples. Somebody must have gotten here first.
Someone must have gotten here first.
It must have been the aliens from that one Indiana Jones movie.
Oh God,
the one with Shia LaBeouf.
Yeah, Crystal Skull.
Yeah.
Sorry, I had almost successfully forgotten that movie. So thanks for reminding me.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to everyone listening to this. I'm so sorry to Chris. I'm so sorry to Josiah. I'm so sorry to Craig. Craig did not deserve to learn about Kingdom of the Crystal Skull.
I'm disappointed.
Anyway.
So as things move into this this interaction with Europe, trade is being introduced between Africa and Europe, and things get pretty fucked up because of that. And there's a lot of different ways it gets fucked up. The first thing, of course, is that Europeans were really interested in this slave economy thing that's going on here. And they would like a lot of slaves because they discovered this new world thing and they need labor.
And they're killing the people who already live there too fast.
Yes.
The new world, which had just materialized into existence.
It didn't exist priority. Yeah, there was
nobody
there.
Look at all of this land. Could you please move?
It was uninhabited.
Untouched.
No, I'm not going to go into Israel Palestine.
We're not doing
it. You are reminding me of that Eddie Izzard flag bet. Do you have a flag? No flag, no country. Those are the rules that I just made up. What do you mean? We live here.
Yeah, I mean, basically.
So from a Marxist framework anyway, oftentimes when you look at this, you will point to, Basque history of the world kind of talks about this too. The development of European capitalism is predominantly developed through trade, like through ocean power, through ship power. That's how capitalism was born. I'll mention, side note, really interesting Marxist scholar Marcus Rediker. If you ever read any of his work, he argues that slave ships were the original factories in like how they were structured. It's very interesting, and like he points to like the development of the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, the various like class formations being present on ships during this time. And eventually getting harbored into the production in capitalism. Very good. Slave Ship: A Human History, amazing book. But
also was just like struck again to go back to the metaphor of that they're like an oil tanker.
Well, I mean, ships are a big part of the development of capitalism and also the development of labor, the proletariat as a class. We know strike. Do you know where the word strike comes from? is all the, all sailors striking the masts and not sailing going on, So like it's yeah. So we're seeing the development of, the capitalist class taking place, throughout this shift to kind of global trade around ships. And then one of the biggest commodities that start to get transported is, of course, enslaved people from Africa. Yeah. And what this was, I think, one of the things that felt so obvious that this book had said, and I had never considered it, which was I had predominantly thought of the damage that the slave trade had done being to, and I still think this would be the predominant thing you should focus on at times is of course the people who were enslaved. That's the predominant harm that's taking place. But something I had never considered is the impact that stealing huge amounts of the labor force and the population was doing to the continent in Africa, like to Africa. This was something that Rodney really talks about, just how devastating this was to the continent, that I just had never considered. I had just generally not thought much about it.
There's so much labor potential that instead of being able to innovate and thrive in Africa, was now being spent wantonly in order to enrich dickbags from Europe.
Yeah, I mean, to lay the foundations of what would eventually become Europe and the Americas today. And I do think, and Rodney points this out, but I think another scholar that does a very good job, oft maligned, and I know on the Mammonberg Discord, another related podcast, on the Mammonberg Discord, I am the strongest Ibram Kendi defender.
Okay.
He has a wonderful book called Stamped from the Beginning. We won't talk about the anti-racist baby book, but we're gonna focus on. We're going to focus on his book, Stamped from the Beginning, where he actually talks about the material origins of racism and how essentially...
Which Rodney also gets into.
Yeah, and he gets into it, but in Stamped from the Beginning, Kendi traces a very concrete line from Henry the Navigator of Portugal going, hey, there's all these African slaves that are, easily accessible and are, basically easier for us to get than the Slavs, and other sources of slaves. So we're just going to do that, and it helped enrich Portugal, and basically Henry's biographer, cannot remember his name, was basically like, okay, well, we got to come up. I'm going to make up a reason that that this was okay. That I'm going to make up a reason why we focused on African slaves as opposed to others, and basically just out of whole cloth invented the idea that they were, inferior. And also that they were inferior in certain ways, but also great laborers and blah blah blah, and they were naturally slave-like, etc. And all your classic racial epithets are basically just a post hoc rationalization for a market decision.
Not to jump too far ahead, but this is also an interesting chunk of toward the end of this book. One of Rodney's things that I thought was really interesting was his definition of fascism versus capitalism, and predominantly defines it as, a situation in which that racial ideology that is developed in order to justify capitalism ends up becoming more important than actually making a profit. When the actual functioning of the capitalist system is more invested in maintaining the ideology of racism, because, as we've kind of talked about the last episode and this episode, there are times in which it is not even from capitalist logic in the best interests of people to be acting this racistly, like in the best interests of the white colonizers or whatever. Sometimes it is worse for them. but they're so committed to the racial ideology. Like, for instance, with the case of late Victorian Holocaust or something, it's like, well, like killing a third of your labor is fucking stupid. That's a stupid thing to do unless you really hold to the racial ideology that was formed to justify you doing that in the first place.
or that your short-term profit is more important to you than any sort of society building and long-term sustainability. Like, I don't really care because I have allowed myself to believe that these people aren't equal to me. So I can just view them as a commodity. And if this commodity goes away or becomes less productive, I'll just switch to a different one. But and
that actually leads me to I did want to read this. I know we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but I do want to read this quote because you set me up perfectly for it. In the vein of, I don't care because these people are less than me. Excuse me. A Brazilian plantation owner was asked why the death rate among his slaves was so exaggerated. It was pointed out to him that this obviously did him great harm. He quickly replied that, quote, on the contrary, it brought him no injury at all, since when he purchased a slave, it was with the purpose of using him for only a single year, after which very few could survive, but that nevertheless he made them work in such a way that he not only recovered the capital employed in their purchase, but also made a considerable profit. And besides, what does it matter if the life of a black man is destroyed by 1 year of unbearable toil, if from this we derive the same advantages which we would have if he worked at a slower pace for a long period of time? This is how many people reason.
And I think that, of course you have to make up an ideology to justify that mindset. Of course you have to invent something.
And I do just want to note that that's from a book called Children of God's Fire, a documentary history of slavery in Brazil, edited by Robert Edgar Conrad.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I mean that's so of course there begins to be this ideology of racism because you have to make up an explanation for that mentality. Because if you take off you take off ideology and look at what you're just saying there about a human being, like of course you have to believe that human being is subhuman. How else do you justify that in your head? You know what I mean?
Or you could be like the enlightened gentleman, largely gentlemen at the University of Chicago.
Oh, my friends. Yeah.
Actually, and reason that actually slavery is bad. It's morally bad, but actually it's worse. It's worse than that. It's inefficient.
It's inefficient.
It's economically inefficient. The worst thing. But
it's like, what if I told you they didn't care about efficiency?
Yeah, what if I told you efficiency wasn't the point?
Well,
and of course, this is a real paper. There's a real study conducted by University of Chicago economists, and essentially they try to show that, and they admit that quantifying the productivity which would have existed if slavery wasn't there is difficult. But that basically what they do is they say, following emancipation, there was a massive increase in productivity and like per capita income, I believe. I can't remember exactly, but which. To me, not having
imagine
read the paper,
that.
I have to admit, I have to full disclosure. I haven't read the whole thing. I'm not going to pay for that shit.
I'm not paying for a University of Chicago.
I'm just not. Look, I'm not that guy. I'm not gonna read you Chicago stuff. I know that makes me a biased, filthy socialist. I don't care.
Yeah.
Milton Friedman can burn in hell until until all of his sins are purified and he finally gets to see the face of God with the rest of us. It'll just take him a lot longer. But anyway, uh, my response to you Chicago boys is one, so fucking what?
Mhm.
Who cares if the market is distorted? The main issue is that
the
it's morally
human
wrong.
one? Yes.
And number two, yeah, that's like we already knew that it wasn't
The
we
most
already knew
efficient.
that paying your laborers results in increased growth for the economy.
Because now more people
We
have money to spend.
yeah,
It's wild how that
exactly.
happens.
Yeah,
Well,
it's so fucking crazy.
and I could imagine Walter Rodney, were he alive and reading that, I could imagine the snarky thing he would say about that, which is just like, yeah, that's what capitalists figured out in the 19th century. That's why they abolished slavery. You fucking idiot. Of course. They figured
Yeah.
that out. And eventually...
That's actually a very consistent theme across socialist scholars. One now somewhat discredited, Mr. Chomsky, described that basically argued that South African apartheid ended, of course, in part by the efforts of Black South Africans, along with their allies from none other than Cuba and Olof Palme's Sweden, among others.
What a strange combination of people. Anyway.
He actually, Olof Palme's Sweden supported a lot of third world revolutionary movements, but that's just an aside. Chomsky's argument was that the West had moved beyond South Africa and the U.S. His point was about the U.S. changing its support for apartheid. You know, for a long time, the U.S. was all about apartheid. Ronald Reagan was like, "Let's go, yeah."
I mean,
Cool.
we'd only stopped doing it like 20 years earlier. So
Right.
Interestingly, yeah, I mean, even the ADL was working with apartheid South Africans to root out white apartheid South Africans, apartheid supporting South Africans to root out communists in America. But that's another story for another day. But the U.S. support for apartheid shifted when they realized they actually would prefer to have a larger skilled labor force in South Africa.
That they
there was
could
a
sell
material, yeah, there was a material reason for America changing its support for apartheid. So you know, it's you always see this. It's very. I mean, obviously, this is of course taking nothing away from the activists, the revolutionaries that fought to overthrow
No.
Oppressive governments.
But like what Rodney, I think I don't want to put words in Rodney's mouth, but I think what Rodney would say to this is why you need to be attuned to the way that capitalism or colonialism is evolving. Because yeah, you could be stuck fighting a war that might be already over and not see the new fucking vile way they've discovered, you know, to continue the thing. So yeah, slavery went away and got replaced by the scramble with Africa.
Yeah.
You know, like, which was just a new way of oppressing Africans.
Or in the United States, it went away and got replaced by Jim Crow.
Exactly, right. Like,
yeah,
that's why
sharecropping, Jim Crow, etc. Yeah.
Yep.
Critique should not end with just this one specific form that exists. But yeah, you know, so yeah, talking about slavery like we did here, of course, as Rodney will say, is bringing in massive amounts of labor like that to develop the quote unquote New World. And the U.S. does not exist without slavery. I don't think anyone listening to this would find that statement controversial. The U.S. is able to develop because of using that free labor until eventually switching to a complete full capitalist mode of production in the Marxist sense. And so, yeah, I mean, because of this, you can say that, like, what Rodney is arguing is that Africa contributed just like Europe would not be as advanced or developed if it weren't for Africans that they were stepping on and pulling from. You know, like that.
Yeah.
You know, the spoils, you know, the great achievements of quote unquote Western civilization or whatever don't exist without Africans.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like people always talk about, oh, Africa is filled with all these natural resources. You know, why is it not so developed? It's because not to use another Marxist term, but the surplus value of all of that stuff is going somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
by force.
It's very
by force.
Yeah, and in a very literal sense, you know, the gold that was in the mines in Ethiopia is now fucking, you know, making Versailles in France or whatever. That's
like
I don't know if
vault.
that's true.
It's in the Barclays
you know
vault
I mean?
or some shit.
Yeah,
you know?
like.
Josiah, I see where you've got your cursor in the notes. I think that's a great quote.
Oh yeah, and
oppression follows logically from exploitation, so as to guarantee the latter. Oppression of African people on purely racial grounds accompanied, strengthened, and became indistinguishable from oppression for economic reasons. I mean, that's like a perfect summation of what we've been saying here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then I guess we might as well then dive right into where this goes from here, which is officially, you know, the scramble for Africa and the process of now proper like colonization in what you, when you think of that word, that actually taking place, right?
Which of course we would argue that colonialism is so much more than, you know, setting up specific political subdivisions.
Right. And that's what, I mean, up until this point, we've been talking about a form of colonialism, and now we're doing to the most manifest form of it.
Now we're doing the colonialism that you learn about in AP European history.
Right.
This is like going from Charmander to Charmeleon.
This is
and we're not yet at Lenin's final form of capitalism. Yeah. This is not even capitalism's final form.
And now we'll also, you know, like what Rodney points to is during this period, this is also a period in which Europe is also intentionally underdeveloping Africa. So there's an example of like, you know, he talks about both the Ethiopian Empire and the Congo Empire in the 19th century, specifically were like requesting trade networks with Europe in order to continue developing and like probably form capitalism. And Europe chose not to do that.
Requesting help building factories, and Europe going, no, we'd rather you not know how to do that.
Yeah.
It's very obvious. Like it's not. Yeah. It's a lot like late Victorian Holocaust, and where people are like, "This is a conspiracy," and it's like
no, they said it.
They literally said it.
It's like from I think you should leave. Oh my God, he admitted it.
He admitted it. He literally admitted it over and over and over and over again.
There's a quote from the last chapter that's relevant for this part here, where he says, "It's fairly obvious that capitalists do not set out to create other capitalists who would be rivals. On the contrary, the tendency of capitalism in Europe from the very beginning was one of competition, elimination, and monopoly. Therefore, when the imperialist stage was reached, the metropolitan capitalists had no intention of allowing rivals to arise in the dependencies." And so this was in reference to the independence movements, what we'll get to later, but this is also relevant now because this is, you know, right around the 19th century. There are prime targets for the development of a competitor in the world economy that could be developed, that are asking to be developed, but Europe doesn't want rivals, and so they step on it.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing. I was talking about this with y'all before we started recording, and I harp on it a lot, but this is a point where I like to clarify that. You know, because people will say, well, capitalism isn't monopoly. Capitalism is when there's free exchange of commodities in the market. And it's like, okay, well, we're talking about different things, because capitalism is private ownership of the means of production, of productive property. the associated properties that come with that. Capitalism is not markets. Markets were there before, and inshallah, yes, white guy saying inshallah, that's classic, but we'll be here after capitalism.
Yeah, well, because markets, in just the very literal, basic sense of it, have existed as long as we've had, like the ability to transport a commodity from one part of the globe to the other. Like that's not it. But the nature of the
economic markets, of course, exist. Proper markets, I would say, exist only after states form. But like even the most rudimentary state, though.
Yeah. Someone to kind of right
to set rules, right?
To set rules.
Kind of like we were saying earlier, a guarantor of debt.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's that's right. So they're wanting to join in these markets, but the nature of capitalism is the want to like maintain your control of a monopoly and to eliminate competitors. And so
why would I want as a private property owner, why would I want to only why would I want to lower my personal line of where supply meets demand or whatever the fuck? Why would I want to lower my marginal utility or whatever the fuck microeconomic bullshit we learned back in college was? I'm obviously butchering the terms, but why would I want to reach market equilibrium when I could just control it all?
Right. I mean, typical HOA president behavior.
Yeah.
Right. And this is where it ideologically, throughout the 19th century, we see the shift of more and more European countries eventually not having slavery anymore, through the, of course, the work of activists and stuff, but also they're developing a different type of capitalism that does not need to rely on slavery. And because of that, suddenly Europeans feel they have the moral high ground on this issue about slavery. And so the slave market did continue in the eastern chunks of Africa, predominantly slave trade with Arabic countries. And so because of that, Europeans were able to justify their expansion into Africa by saying, well, we're here to end the slave trade, which, there are multiple snarky comments from Rodney throughout this. About it's really interesting you guys fucking invent this demand, and then
it's like in Team America World Police, if you recall this wonderful film.
Oh jeez, this is going to be a cut
where Team America shows up in Paris and just completely destroys the Louvre, the Eiffel Tower, little bakeries, etc., etc. And then at the end, it's you're welcome, people of France. We caught the terrorists.
Yeah, and that's what happened.
We did it, Patrick. We saved the city.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, just fucking demolishing Africa in order to save from this damn slave industry. I wonder how this came about.
We completely destroyed. We stole all your people.
Everybody's looking for the guy who did this.
We took all of your labor potential. We wouldn't give you any kind of help. We wouldn't let you in on our technological secrets, unless of course it benefited us. But now, after seeing all that we've wrought, we're here. We've come to save the day. Don't worry.
And with this arrival, of course, comes the extraction of more and more minerals. So we've already drained all your labor, and now we're gonna drain. Now we're going to show up and enforce labor, but it's not slavery anymore. It's just forced labor. It's different. And you're gonna
we're technically paying you, but you have to work.
Yeah, and it's of course it's not enough money to survive. Actually, I don't remember.
He gives a good example of this. Which is that Nigerian coal miners at Enugu made a fraction of what the Scottish and German miners earned. they earned 1 shilling per day for underground jobs and 9 pence per day for surface work. Europeans earned 7 times that amount per hour.
Mm-hmm. And part of this was because, as we talked about, it was Africa, chunks of Africa were in that communalist stage. And so this is kind of the same thing we talked about with late Victorian Holocaust. There were these traditional mutual aid might be the right word for it. There was traditional
David Graeber calls it primitive communism.
Whatever label you want. There was an early form of the clan takes care of each other, whatever. And so because of that, the colonists knew they don't actually have to pay a living wage. Like, they can still keep the labor around. People won't die. Well, until they do. People won't die as fast because there's already this safety net built in. There's kind of this traditional welfare state. You know what I mean? That kind of exists there. And so we can pay them $1 because they're not going to starve to death because someone else will feed them if they start starving. So, and then because we're paying $1, it's not slavery. And so we're here to stand up against slavery.
Awesome.
What a cool system, guys.
So free. Free.
They're bringing democracy to the...
Yeah. I love talking about what freedom is with people, and I'm like, okay, well, what is freedom if you're starving?
Right.
Right.
But, well, and on this, the logic is, okay, well, you're kept alive by, your communal mutual aid, but then they force them to work in ways that destroy the soil. So now they can't even mutually aid themselves.
Right.
And What's then going on? What happened? Like you said, we're all trying to find the guy who did this. Who denutrienated, or whatever the word would be, the soil? What happened?
Or to produce cash crops instead of growing. Hey, you now have to do all of this land that you were cultivating for your own food. Well, now you have to plant palms so that we can get palm oil, or now you have to plant cotton, and we're not even going to let you weave the cotton, and we're not even actually going to let you pick the seeds out of the cotton with a cotton gin. We're going to pay a middleman to do that, and then we're going to ship it to our nice, cool textile mills back on the continent
in Manchester or wherever.
Or in Manchester or in Birmingham and Liverpool, and then so we're gonna continually value add, quote unquote, to this, and you're not gonna see a cent of that.
Yeah,
but also all of that land that you were just that you were growing food on, we need you to plant cotton on that now. We need you to plant palms.
But don't worry. In return, you're getting schools and railroads, and those railroads are definitely for you, and not just to take the cotton from point A to point B.
And that education's definitely for you. That's why we're in the French colonies teaching you that, well, you're the descendant of the Gauls who had blue eyes and white skin.
Yes, and Napoleon was your best general.
Yes. I'm sure this is really relevant to your everyday Algerian. This is he spends a good chunk on both of those things, and railroads again, it's kind of what we talked about last time. It's railroads are cool and all, but they're being built just to pull shit out rather than transport things from here to there.
It's kind of hey, what is the use case for this railroad? Is this railroad to make it so that people can move around more easily, or is it so that we can move the things that people make around more easily?
Always that. It's
so fascinating.
It's pretty important which one of those railroads you're getting. Right now in the United States, we have great freight railroads, and that's why our rail transit system is so fucking bad.
And it's just this book does an amazing job showing how many every aspect of the trade or supply chains or whatever that are getting formed. Every aspect of it seems designed to fuck over Africans more. and more. So like even down to, I think we kind of hinted at this, but like, you know, yeah, they're not building factories in Africa because they're extracting from Africa. So like, you know, I think it's later on they talk about like, you know, oftentimes how it's getting set up is mines are in Africa, so they could use Africans for manual labor, but not for anything that will require technical education. You know,
you're
things
not
that would
skilled labor. You're not creating skilled labor because if you teach them too much, remember, and there's a quote in there somewhere. I don't have the page, but basically they say if you teach them too much, they'll rebel.
Exactly,
Yeah,
and
people,
so that's why
people tend to get ideas.
So they're not even putting factories in there because factories might have a residual positive impact. And so because of that, they're like, well, what can we do that minimizes that as much as possible? Well, we'll pull the iron from here, but we'll make the steel in Europe because we don't want anyone knowing how to make steel or insert various things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly which colonial power it was. I think it might have been Germany. Did eventually in a couple of its places like teach people how to like repair mining equipment because it was just cheaper to have Africans know how to do that than it was to like pay Europeans to be down there and do it. But that's like it.
You know, not to mention something we glossed over during the pre like colonial period and more the trade colonization period was that the only trade that was going into Africa was hand-me-downs. Because they found a way to make money off of, well, okay, shit that people don't want in Europe, we can shove it down in Africa and they'll buy it. And so like,
boy, I sure hope that doesn't.
They literally were like, here, you can have our Super Bowl shirts.
Yeah. And so like,
not just our Super Bowl shirts, our Super Bowl loser shirts.
Loser shirts, yeah.
Right. But because of
you
this,
can have the loser shirts, everyone.
There's a sense that this erodes like over long term erodes too. If like, for instance, you couldn't buy sheets that are brand new in Africa. You can only buy ones that have holes in it that were previously used by a white couple up north.
Which is fucking disgusting.
It's truly like
so gross.
And you know, and that's where like, I mean, and that builds up to what's going on today. I mean, even now you talk about like the quality of consumer goods are not as good in most regions of the world as it is here and in Europe. And it is that system maintaining itself. You know, like
yeah. And although weirdly now we have exported the manufacture of the quality consumer goods that we use to these places, and we won't let them have the good stuff that they make.
Well, right, because we developed a new, you know, whatever you want to call it, stage or whatever, right? The birth of the information economy or whatever. And so now we're going to do that, but we're not going to let that happen too much over there because then that's going to allow more people to get trained and educated. And when they're that way, they start being rowdy. Oh, man. This book's making me like a fucking Leninist.
Well, it's literally like...
I'm just like looking at Josiah's notes, and he's got the bit about Unilever, which I think is just such a fascinating thing.
Do we want to just go to Unilever as like a good example here? Because it is a really good case study.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it fits very well with everything that we're doing here. They're intimately connected with the colonial powers. They end up a corporation functioning almost exactly as its own colonial power. They have police powers and things like that. They are able to buy massive tracts of land for very little money, and then they just turn it into palm forests so that they can make soap for people. And then I thought this was really interesting. The reason Unilever turns from being a soap company with a monopoly over essentially soap production in this area into the giant global conglomerate that we know today is because actually monopolies are incentivized to innovate. Because if you don't innovate, somebody will come up with something better than you, and your stuff that you have a monopoly over won't be desirable and people won't buy it. And so they like develop margarine and detergents and like all sorts of stuff. They start buying grocery stores. It's like Unilever turns into a thing where you've got a 50% chance, I would think, of buying something that Unilever either owns or used to own if you go to a supermarket and fill up your cart, which is wild.
Unilever is like one of those companies that, if you're unfamiliar, basically owns the world. Like it owns like most brand, like so many brands you can think of. And it's because of that. I mean, honestly, one of the best chunks of this book, if somebody isn't able to read the whole book and they're just going to read a few chunks, one chunk, that Unilever chunk, because it is the best, like, here is how the logic of capitalism plays out at every step. And it's just so logical in how this company grows. Like it makes sense. The next move. Okay. We can make soap. Okay. We can make the soap. Well, let's go ahead and buy our own palm kernel crushing mill so that we don't have to be buying it from them. Okay. And then we're going to buy our own place to get palm in the Congo. Okay. Now we have that. And then you know, like it all just logically step by step, and suddenly you have a fucking empire.
Mm-hmm. But remember, we're encouraging competition. That's what capitalism is doing.
That's what it's all about.
Encouraging competition. It's definitely not using military force to oppose attempts at African self-government. It's definitely not enforcing labor, low wage labor with colonial armed forces. It's definitely not doing anything of that. Actually, what it is it's just entrepreneurs just in the marketplace, just doing
making moves.
Yeah, and making moves. But
and all of this stuff. Oh, go ahead, Jake. Please continue.
Oh no, you go ahead.
Well, all of this does also like because again they're getting all of this stuff through colonialism for like not. I mean, they would call it market value, and I suppose it was because they set the market.
Dirt cheap.
But they weren't paying what it's actually worth, which meant that they were able to then make a ton of money on profits and then spend that money on all sorts of other scientific things, you know.
And their taxes are going to fund welfare states in their home countries.
Mm-hmm.
They are getting doctors, and of course the white settlers in African colonies are getting doctors.
Right.
Yeah.
The
not the native Africans.
And Rodney, of course, points out that the native Africans are not don't have access, barely have access to, and are not being trained as doctors.
They're
the
getting
Europeans are keeping that profession for themselves, and
and
of course, the Chicago boys would say, okay, well then it's not real capitalism, but that's another fight to have.
Yeah,
but it's like, okay, well then what is?
What is capitalism? You know, it's
show me actually existing capitalism.
It's kind of funny because a lot of like Chicago, like libertarian thinkers, big classical liberals or whatever, are often very like. They do the thing that they make fun of communists for doing. You know the classic communist thing of like, oh, the USSR or China. Well, that's not real communism, and that gets made fun of all the time. And sure, there's something to make fun of to that to an extent, but also like, let's be real. They do this about capitalism all the time.
Yeah. Real capitalism has never been tried.
Yeah, real capitalism has never been tried. Supposedly, there's just been a whole lot of colonial and fascist states that got formed.
Crony capitalism.
Yeah, that was crony capitalism.
All the words I used to say when I was a libertarian. Have to reiterate that Friedrich Hayek was a universal healthcare guy.
That's true.
Just want to point that out for the libertarians in the room. Yeah.
I wonder where we're going to get all that money for universal healthcare under Hayek's system.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's probably going to be from Africans.
Yeah, I wonder how he thought. I wonder how he thought we were going to pay for that.
Yeah, and it's true. You know, as someone who would like to see a more robust, and I'm sure all of us would like to see a more robust welfare state enacted in
Mhm.
America. There was a material cost in building those welfare states, and although a lot of it was down to the hard fought victories of labor movements in Western and Northern European countries, the money for it, a lot of that money came from exploiting Africa and other underdeveloped parts of the world.
Mhm.
And it's
It has to be
it,
admitted.
and it's easier for the the ruling class to assent to a more robust social net for the few people in the metropole, as
Yeah,
long as that can be used to prevent them from gaining consciousness of the people whose exploitation is allowing that safety net.
oh
Mhm.
Like
yeah, you
if
gotta
if
you
you
gotta keep the poor white man just a little bit above and higher in station than the poor black man. So
well, and
Mhm.
also a little bit ignorant of the condition of
that's
those
very
poor
true as
people.
well. That's very
Like
true
Mhm.
as well. And
they need to have like plausible deniability of that's not my fault.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, that's very true.
Yeah, yeah, or yeah, and I mean, right, and then that's where like, this book was kind of preempting something that would come later. I associate, especially with the '90s, of that kind of like charitable organization view of Africa, of like, oh
Hmm.
dear, it's just so poor and chaotic over there. It's so sad. We're gonna build a well, and that's
Hmm.
that's
God,
it, and that's
the wells, dude.
yeah, and
There's a
like
coffee shop. Sorry, there's a coffee shop across the street from my alma mater, where their
yeah,
whole thing is like a portion of the
building.
proceeds goes to building wells in
Yes.
Africa,
And
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 it's just like
and I don't doubt someone living in an area
it's
that
good.
needed a well is going like, sure, that's fine, but like,
It's good, like it's good work, but it's like
but zooming
there's
out
a
here,
reason that you are doing that, and that the African government, the government of the particular African state that you're
isn't
in, isn't doing that.
right. And point being, this is the modern day ideology that makes that maintains kind of what we're talking about. That is the way of kind of not having to think through, like, yeah, that our any existing welfare state we could form in the U.S. would still be built off of the super profits from Africa. How do we make that make sense? Well, we see it as just a accident of nature that Africa is this way,
Yeah,
and that
it's a
also
clash of
justifies.
civilizations type thing.
Yeah, it is, and appeals to things like tribalism and stuff, as we've talked about. In a lot of ways, it's interesting that I think Rodney was gesturing at the Rwandan genocide before it happened. He talks a lot about how
Oh yeah. Hmm.
these ethnic divides are were fostered throughout the colonial period, and he specifically talks through the makeup of Rwanda in a chunk of this book
Yeah.
that really stuck out to me, because he's predating what was going to happen. So anyway, he spends a good amount of time on education as well,
Yeah.
which I think is interesting, because I don't feel like that's correct me if I'm wrong, that's not traditionally a Marxist focus usually when talking about this kind of stuff. Am I wrong there? You guys both have like now you're trying to think of whether I'm wrong or not facial expressions.
I don't know if I would say that, because isn't the whole, well, maybe I'm getting too Leninist, but
Mm-hmm.
like a large part of it is raising class consciousness, which
That's true.
is like kind of done through education. I don't think it probably wouldn't be that the classic, like Karl Marx is like, let's do universal. I mean, maybe he did believe this, but like, and I just am not knowledgeable enough on it. But you know, maybe Karl Marx wasn't going, we need a universal public school for all workers, but he was going like, these people need to know about like history and like what their plight is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I
Yeah,
don't
I
know
think I
if
would agree with that. I think it's pretty notable that something that like they did in the USSR was like massively moved to
Sure.
get the population literate. Some of that is so that they can read the propaganda that you're producing, but some of it is also like they are trying to, and like, I mean, it's the same, like Cuba did that as well, you know.
Sure.
Better literacy rates than us.
Yep.
That's true. Okay.
Also,
so maybe
we're not, and sorry, I don't want to go on my rant, but it's not as if we're not reading propaganda as well.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Of course. Yeah, not to. That's not unique. Propaganda is not unique to the USSR. We're not bringing up Israel Palestine, but I'm just going to gesture that direction, and you can see what I'm talking about. But returning
so glad I'm not really on the internet anymore.
We're not talking about it.
But no, so he does focus on education, and I think it's important for a couple reasons. One is because, like, education seems to be increasingly associated with people fighting for independence movements, because this book is getting written right around, I wouldn't say like the decolonial like independence movements aren't done by the 70s, but they're wrapping up here. Like we've started to see really this taking place in Africa over the last few decades when this came out. And a lot of it comes back to like the initial radicalizing thing, the building of that consciousness, right, was around.
I'm sorry. You mean the period in which the Queen of England graciously allowed all of these colonies free, right? But but the
sorry, I'm just remembering a meme from the 2012 Olympics when the Queen was sitting in the stadium in London and looking out at everything, and somebody just do you remember that Gautier song? And so they like did the face paint over it, and now you're just a country that I used to own.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, yikes.
But so education was like, having very unfair education that was like I joked about, like French colonies having this classroom of African children and telling them that they were descendants of the Gauls is like, there was this was a very obvious irritation that a lot of people who were experiencing it and rallying around it. It was a consciousness building thing. A lot of these independence movements started with first the fight for giving us an actual education that's relevant to us here right now. And, education is really tied to one of the kind of favorite subjects between Chris and I whenever we're on here, it feels like, it's nationalism. And education is a big part of how you develop a national myth. He doesn't get into this too much, but I recall this is a huge part of Algeria after Algeria's independence, was also figuring out, like, not, education, what language do we need to all speak? Because, Arabic is a big language, and then I believe there was an indigenous language, and then so is French. Yep. Do we want to teach French, but we just did a decolonial war, so it feels kind of fucked up to be teaching French when our whole thing is being against this French colonization? Like, these are hard questions, but they're happening a lot in the educational sphere as they're trying to form, like, what is our national identity? Because that is how the national identity gets passed to you, is through the education system generally. And
it's also how you break other identities. I mean, it's part of why conservatives in the United States are always so freaked out at any sort of intrusion of a language other than English in the public sphere. They're like, no, speak English. And it's because by doing that, you erode the other identity to a certain extent.
Right. And that's why, and that's why these independence movements often started with this, because what had eroded their identity as Africans was predominantly this education system that was built around, teaching, white bourgeois education. Right. And
for the vast majority of people, teaching them like just enough, like not even letting most people have like a quote unquote proper education, but being like, you made it to third grade, that's good enough.
Yeah. This is a really interesting chunk of this was talking about the education bottleneck. And this was part of what built up the kind of resentment that leads to an independence movement is all these people get in the education system and they get to 6th grade and they're all right, ready for 7th grade now. And then there's like no one teaching 7th grade. There's like 3 classrooms and they're all full. And that bottleneck, I mean, you start setting up the situation of educated people pissed off with no prospects for work anymore, which is a consistent that always causes problems. like this is arguably the situation the U.S. is in a very different way is in nowadays. Even a lot of people with college education, but no job to really apply that college education. And I think at least 2 of us, this is a description of us. And, and imagine a colonial setting is like, it's getting in this situation about 8th grade. Like the people are getting an 8th grade education, not having the ability to step up to the next year, and then just being given this education and then not being able to use it or get a job with it or anything. So that's how you built the kind of resentment that you can build an independence movement around. So the independent school movement was part of that and whatever. And over the last, couple decades leading up to when this book came out, we saw numerous complicated independence movements that played out in their own unique ways that are unique to them. That would be a whole individual episode for each way it played out. We could do a whole episode on the Algerian Revolution. You know what I mean? These are real complicated in how they played out. But what we see is eventually the formation of independent states in Africa is finally happening. And, this is kind of the conditions that Rodney leaves the book in, talking about what he calls flag independence, because he doesn't want to even call it independence yet, because he believes that a lot of these colonial structures are still very alive within these countries. And, because
Spoiler alert.
Got him killed saying that. And that, this was one step, but we're not there yet. Nationalism is one step, but we got to go farther. We need socialism.
Speaking of flag independence, he mentions over and over and over again that Liberia was technically flag independent, but it
was just a colony.
It was just a colony of the United States for a long time. Probably could be called that.
Yeah, very much could. Is also the place where all the rubber for Firestone tires comes from. So there you go.
That's why Dayton, Indiana, or Ohio.
I was going to say, he has this quote where he says on this topic where he actually says I think it's interesting where he says that Europe caused in terms of decolonialization, Europe caused the underdevelopment in Africa, but it's on every African to do whatever they can to reverse that process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's interesting is you see that start to happen through these independence movements, but I think it's of course unfortunate that he was assassinated, but even more unfortunate is that 3 years after his assassination, if Rodney had lived, he would have lived to see the rise to power of Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, and a Marxist revolution right there in Africa that
got rat fucked all to hell.
Well, yeah, that got absolutely rat fucked. But at the time was doing a lot of the things that Rodney that I think Rodney would have praised. Refusing money from the IMF, mounting massive literacy campaigns, vaccinating people against meningitis, raising the level of gender equality. Lots of things that we would normally praise. But of course, it's a Marxist doing it, and more so. Remember that it's a black Marxist, so he must be some evil dictator, and eventually gets couped himself. But I do think it's unfortunate that Rodney was not around to see a very powerful attempt at building a new kind of modern African society by and for Africans.
I really wish Rodney had survived to speak about the decades following this book, because there's a lot that happens, a lot I don't even know very well enough about, but like a lot takes place in Africa. And one thing I think would be interesting, and is might be worth bringing up, is like, how do you think Rodney would feel about China's engagement with Africa over the last decade?
You mean like the Belt and Road stuff?
Yeah, yeah.
I think that he would view it as just another recapitulation of colonialism with socialist pants on.
Yeah,
I think that's tough because I don't know, because when that's so hard to say, because his clear affection for socialist states is very much on display. And I'm not totally sure he wouldn't have tried. I'm obviously just totally I'm pulling this out of my ass, but it just seems like he may have been
defended,
hesitant to say, actually, what China's doing is the same as what the colonial powers were doing.
Yeah, I can't decide, because there is a chunk in the beginning, and I can't find the exact quote, but he makes a comment where he's like, "Were the USSR, or I don't know if he says or China, but he said, were the USSR to begin extracting from Africa, then them being socialist is irrelevant. They would still be contributing to the underdevelopment of Africa." He just didn't believe they were doing that.
Okay, yeah.
And so
I missed that quote. I apologize. I'm just talking.
I might be.
We have no idea.
I might be remembering it as a little more. It might have been a throwaway comment. I don't remember it super well, but I recall a statement like that. Were that to be the case, I think he would have a negative view of China. But I think, you look at the nature of these like Leninist thinkers, thinkers of his kind of ilk in the decades following this period, and a lot of them fell into this trap of really trying to defend regimes that are just, let's be real, China is just state capitalism, very obviously. I don't feel like I need to caveat that at all. Deng said as much. Communism for the capitalists, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think I'm not even sure that. I don't think Rodney would have been on board with. Deng for sure. I think he would have begun to. I think he probably would have tried to be like, okay, no, it's okay, but where we are now, he would absolutely not. The Belt and Road, he would not be a fan. He would not be a fan.
Yeah.
And of course, like I said, this is just totally out of my ass. It's after reading conjecture. One book.
Conjecture.
Who knows what historical contingencies would have happened to make him believe a certain thing or a certain way?
Sure.
But I think this is. What I can say is that this guy is brilliant. He's just like.
It's a really, really big loss to world intellectual pursuits that he got blown up.
Yeah, like in his 30s, right? Like, man, how so much this dude had to offer still. Frankly, it's
and just an absolute titan, and so much so that Angela Davis is writing the foreword to the book.
Yeah, right. We didn't even mention that. Yeah, Angela Davis. And
this guy is, regardless of what his beliefs would be now, he absolutely hit the nail on the head. That the reason, when we ask ourselves, things, why are things like that? It's so complicated. All that bullshit.
It's not really.
It's really not. Like, it's a lot of history. Like that's what I think. I think that it's like Keanu said. It's not complicated. It's just voluminous. It's just a lot of history to know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because I kind of regret it, but there's just no way we could have done it. We barely got into the individual stories that he tells throughout this about like much more zoomed in on like the story of how the region that is Zimbabwe developed and the important figures that sprung up in that time, in the various regions. Like we didn't get into a lot of that, and I have a lot.
We
of
didn't even
notes
talk
on
about
it.
like Shaka.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about Shaka, which is crazy. But he spends a good chunk on that. Like this is this book is not is not possible for us to capture in a 2-hour podcast. You should read it.
And I do want to note that Shaka was a ruler, and of course I'm totally blanking on the state which he ruled now, but was considered by Europeans as one of the greatest rulers in history, on par with or greater than many esteemed European rulers. And maybe this is just, Europeans hyping it up and doing like an Orientalist sort of romance of this ruler. But I mean, they have no reason to lie.
Well, but it was the Amazulu. That's who he led.
So
and
down in South Africa.
Yeah. And I mean, starting out with being the head of a small clan, and then building a fucking empire. Like this guy's
by 40. Didn't he only live like 40 years?
Yeah, and it's like this guy is like like Napoleon or something. He should be considered a great man of history. You know what I mean? Like,
oh my God! You know what I'm realizing is that Walter Rodney named his son Shaka.
Oh, that's awesome. That's sick. So. Was there anything else you guys want to zoom in on before we wrap up here? Because we have been going for a bit.
No, it's. I would be just really fascinated to know. I mean, this book's 51 years old. It would be really fascinating for him to read, if he had made it, to read what he would have to say about the last 50 years. And all of the ways in which we have just sort of continued to rat fuck that continent.
Like, what would his thoughts be on neoliberalism, on the IMF, on and my other thing is like, who
the increasing financialization of capital, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like quote unquote Western capital is now like mostly financialized. It's not even in making stuff. It's in it's in being the owner of the things, and then somebody else makes stuff for you.
We fully become the bankers that he talks about, the aristocracy of the bankers.
Yeah.
You know what pisses? So go ahead.
Oh, and I was just going to say, like, I think it's interesting to think about, like, and somewhere there is an activist writer who is this generation's Walter Rodney, and I don't know who it is. But I would like to know, get in the comments, tell us.
If you do know
scholarship.
Yeah, some really good, because one thing this book did also show me is just how, well, I knew it going into this, but it showed me just how little African history I know. It's something which is something I'd like to correct. You know what I mean? Like, I'd like to know this history better than I do. But yeah, it is incredibly tragic that Walter Rodney was assassinated. I know we've said that 1,000 times, but one thing that just dawned on me, because we had mentioned he was shot when he was assassinated when he was really young, like he was in his 30s. Do you know how young? He was younger than Noam Chomsky. He could have maintained being a public intellectual.
Oh, wow.
If he had not been, like, we would have heard these thoughts. Because think of we know and have the ability to historically reflect on Noam Chomsky's take on 9/11.
And we're still we still hear things from Cornel West, whether they're things we want to hear.
You could say something like that about Chomsky as well, but my point
yeah, exactly, same thing. You don't, don't ask him about
Bosnia. Yeah. Anyway, but
basically anything. Literally, Chomsky's definition of genocide is like fucking the Holocaust and like Armenia, and
that's about it.
That's it.
It's Western propaganda. If it's not, if any other genocide is Western propaganda. Anyway, enough dunking on. Point is, Chomsky is still, he's
around.
He's still around.
And Walter Rodney could have been
around.
Could have been Chomsky. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, we could have gotten takes that are incredibly embarrassing. From
Walter Rodney. Have socialist public intellectual at home.
But no, it is really tragic because I would have liked to hear what he had to say about the IMF and stuff. But
all right, well, I think it would have been. We desperately need,
or like the G8 and the G20.
Oh yeah. That'd be
his thoughts on Davos.
Climate change would be fascinating to.
Mm-hmm.
We desperately need a voice like fighting for the liberation of developing nations, and obviously there are a lot of voices calling for that, but the level of precision and eloquence and just his rhetorical level is like the scholarship is so next level. Like it's you know what I mean?
The scholarship is good, but it's also just like a well-written book that
it's so easy to read. It's like
so fun to read.
Now that being said,
you gotta read all this bullshit by all these professors. That's like, it's like 90% passive voice, and you're like just slogging through the material. And Rodney's like, "No, this is what happened."
Yeah, and like so much writing is nothing but jargon, and like writing like.
Yeah, there is an eloquence I think that's been lost in academic writing. Like I remember reading Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. It was like a war novel. It was beautiful. It's a beautiful history, and like we don't write like that anymore. It feels like it's tragic,
reading, and of course, rip to another real one, David Graeber. David Graeber was like that.
Yeah, he's one of them. And I don't doubt that the modern day Walter Rodney does exist and probably is writing, and I just haven't fucking heard of it. And so
for sure, yeah.
If somebody can does point me to someone, I check them out. I feel like, oh my God, this person's great. I'll do what I can to get others to read. But well, all this said though, we have like one last thing we have to do for this podcast.
Yes.
Which is Chris Barker is next up to pick in our little rotation, what book we're reading. So drum roll, everybody.
Ramp Hollow by Stephen Stoll. The Ordeal of Appalachia.
Oh my God.
Let's go.
This is going to be real interesting.
I believe you mean Appalachia.
Appalachia.
I'm a Yankee, man. I'm never changing the way I say
don't know
that.
I don't know if that's an Appalachian accent. I have no clue. I'm from Texas.
So we're going to Appalachia. Here, wait. What was the name of the book, real quick, so I can Google it? I don't know it, so I'm excited.
Yeah, no, it's Ramp Hollow.
There we go.
Is this ramps like the vegetable?
I assume so. I have not read this, so this is going to be very fun.
Oh, nice. Let's go.
Yeah.
Well, what's give us a pitch.
Yeah. Give us the back cover.
Insight. Here we go. Stephen Stoll offers a fresh, provocative account of Appalachia and why it matters. He begins with the earliest European settlers, whose desires for vast forests to hunt in was frustrated by absentee owners, including George Washington and other founders who laid claim to the region. Even as Daniel Boone became famous as a backwoods hunter and guide, the economy he represented was already in peril. Within just a few decades, Appalachian hunters And farmers went from pioneers to pariahs, from heroes to hillbillies in the national imagination, and the area was locked into an enduring association with poverty and backwardness. Stoll chases these developments with empathy and precision, examining crucial episodes such as the Whiskey Rebellion, the founding of West Virginia, the arrival of timber and coal companies that set off the devastating scramble for Appalachia.
Ooh, here we go.
Let's go.
And
you're gonna sit here and tell me that George Washington was problematic.
I know I'm being very brave right now.
How dare
How
you?
dare you?
Impugn the honor of our great and dear supreme leader,
our great dipshit who got bled to death.
Well, that's right, everybody. Good.
Yeah,
that's right, everybody.
No,
we're driving south to talk about Appalachia. Oh, Chris, guess that because you're living in Appalachia now, aren't you? This was you. You're just getting us to talk about your
at
region.
The very tippy end of.
Yep, at the very butt end of it.
Hell yeah.
I want to see if there's an index.
Not to dox you, but
see, do they? They do mention Chattaboogie.
Let's go.
Page 128.
Well, I'm really excited. I'm hoping we get some labor history. It sounds like we will, but that's what I'm really.
I think that'll be really cool. I think it's interesting to that they called it the scramble for Appalachia.
That was what popped in my head immediately as well.
If
there's going to be overlap, we found it.
Yeah. To the scramble for Appalachia, I think it's interesting to see. I think it'll be interesting to see if there are any parallels between the extractive extractive economies, and how they're wielded.
That was one of the things. That was one of the things that like kind of pinned me to wanting to check this one out and pull it off the to read pile. Was having finished this, and I was like, "Now wait a minute."
That is interesting. I wonder if we can draw a line from Ramp Hollow to Hillbilly Elegy.
There we go. I've read Hillbilly Elegy, and so I can talk about how shitty it is.
Let's go.
Because there's not been enough podcasters tackling J.D. Vance as a subject.
Look, here's the thing that we have a little bit more purchase as three white guys talking about.
Yeah, there we go. Here we go.
a little.
A tiny little bit.
I mean, I'm not Appalachian, but well, you know what? But I do have descendants who are Appalachian, so there we go.
Let's go.
I think we're done with the episode.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Walter Rodney, absolute intellectual titan,
yes,
absolute hero, gave his life for the cause of fighting for a truly liberated Africa and truly liberated world. It was a pleasure to read the book. He absolutely, pleasure in the sense that it was interesting to learn about. An absolute bummer to read about the statistics and things, but I think we all learned a lot.
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Yeah.
And
pour one out for a real one.
All right. Well, we will see you all in. We say this is a monthly thing, but it's kind of more like every other month. So we'll probably see you in February. We'll see.
Wait, we forgot our tradition. We have to say
who's the fuck? Who do we saying fuck?
Well, Europeans, generally Europe.
You had a really good opportunity to say "fuck the Belgians" for this one.
You don't get that one often. You don't get that one often.
He does mention Leopold II at least once.
Yeah. You know what? Yeah, the Belgians, you don't get many books that get you to say fuck the Belgians. And we've covered the French, we've covered the British, so why don't we go ahead and end everybody on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
Fuck the Belgians.
And we'll see you all in theoretically in January, but probably February.
Whenever we get to it.
Have a good one, y'all.
See ya. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Fruitless. If you like what you heard, make sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts and help us out with the algorithm. And subscribe, check out other episodes if you haven't. If you want even more content, you can check out the Patreon. It's in the show notes. And speaking of the Patreon, this show would not be possible without our lovely patrons, who include Gavin Aronson, Stephen Atkinson, The Worst of All Possible Worlds, Moss, Kyle Gannis, Thomas C., James R., Leo Zachary Dickinson, and of course, Chris Barker. We will see you a little bit later this month with Chris Barker returning for a little Christmas special, and then on to the new year. So thank you so much for listening. We'll see you then.